Hi everyone, very warm welcome to you all this evening. Thank you very much for coming in to our debate tonight / getting out of the heat in the lovely air conditioning. I'm Madeleine Morris. I host the Question Time series here at the Wheeler Centre, which is a series that we continue all year long. In my day job, I'm a reporter for 7:30 on the ABC, but I'm lucky enough to be able to do this once a month or so. As you are all extremely aware, because of what's been going on in the media the last couple of days, debate around negative gearing, housing affordability is one of the key issues of our time. Of course, we all know that Melbourne's the most livable city in the world, right? We all know that. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not if you earn an average wage and want to live within 45 minutes of the CBD, or maybe not if you live in the Docklands and you have primary school-aged children who you might want to send to a school maybe. You can't do that because there's no primary school there. Or perhaps if you're one of the 35,000 people who are on the waiting list for public housing in Victoria at this present time. We probably don't think that Melbourne is the most livable city in the world, or of course if you commute in via V-line every day. Don't mention the V word. So everyone does agree that when it comes to affordable housing in Melbourne and in Australia more widely, we are actually in trouble. And interestingly, a poll last year found that only a third of all Melburnians thought that housing was affordable. They may be the Melburnians living in Toorak, I don't know. I don't know many people who think that housing is affordable in this particular city. But some of the questions, it's something we all talk about dinner parties, but it's actually a really major challenge for our time. Why have we come to this state? And more importantly, what can we do about it? And is it all negative gearing's fault? These are some of the questions that we're going to be talking about this evening. And we actually have people who know a lot about this stuff, who would, I'm sure, hold the fort at any dinner table because of your knowledge about this particular stuff. And we're very pleased to have you here this evening. So I'll introduce them. Ken Morrison is the CEO of the Property Council of Australia. Marion Terrill is the Grattan Institute's Transport Program Director, and Jenny Smith is the CEO of the Council to Homeless Persons here in Victoria. So if you'd like to join me in welcoming them this evening. So how this works is this is a genuine question time. So this is your chance to ask questions. We're not about having a panel discussion where I ask all the questions. This is your opportunity to ask some questions of these experts. So we've got two ushers here with microphones, so please signal to them or signal to me, preferably signal to them if you want to ask a question, and they'll go to you and then they'll let me know when they've got a question. And we want to hear people from down the back as much as people down the front, so please don't be backwards in coming forwards. My recommendation is to get your question in early because there's always too much of a rush at the end. We'll go until about 7:15 and we will finish on time. So I'll start with an opening question to you, Jenny, just to warm us up a little. And do you say that do you think that we have a housing crisis in Australia?
Oh, Madeleine, I think we undoubtedly have a housing crisis in Australia and in Victoria and in Melbourne. So in Victoria tonight, there will be at least 23,000 people who are homeless. So that's 23,000 people who are sleeping in the backs of cars, staying in a range of shonky temporary arrangements, young people couch surfing and people sleeping rough. And I think it's extreme weather conditions like this that really bring home to us what sleeping rough means.
And it's not just sleeping rough though. I mean, there are people who are under incredible housing stress, aren't there?
You know, women and children fleeing family violence, sleeping in the backs of cars. Again, in these sorts of conditions, you can imagine what it's like. And so that's people without a home, people without the basis for participating in our community socially and economically. When you don't have a home, you don't tend to be able to get to school, you don't tend to be able to get to your job, you don't tend to be able to look after your health, your diabetes, your heart condition. And
it's not just people who are homeless though, it's all sleeping rough, it's people who are paying exorbitant amounts of their income in rent, for example, which is another
again,
real
we
problem.
know that at least 120,000 households in Victoria will be in housing stress tonight. So those on the lowest 40% of incomes paying more than 30% of that income to put a roof over their head. As you suggest, that means they're not going to be able to afford to appropriate food, appropriate healthcare, education, clothing. It's a lot of us, not just a small few.
Why is housing so bloody expensive, Marion?
So there's a lot of reasons, and it's a complex system, and housing is such a fundamental need. As Jenny said, that we all have to participate in the housing market in some way or other. But I'm very struck by the way that the public debate unfolds. A really important environmental aspect of this is not ever raised, and that is that we have historically low interest rates in this country, and it's a global phenomenon. When interest rates are really low, asset prices are really high. What that means is if you are trying to get into the housing market as a first home buyer, for example, if you have to provide a particular fraction of the asset price as a deposit, it'll be harder now than it has probably ever been, certainly very hard by the standards of recent history to get in. Probably you will find that once you are in, at least your repayments are paying on a very low interest rate. So at that point, the picture changes a bit. So it is quite a complex picture. It is complicated as well by the tax arrangements for investors and owner-occupiers, which I'm sure we're going to get onto very soon.
But what you're, just to sum up there, what you're saying, it's tough to get in, but once you're in, you're in.
Once you're in, you're in. And so if everything else was equal, I think you would find that housing would be more affordable for those in the market. There are a lot of other factors at play, so it's certainly true that there are people in the market who are in housing stress, but it seems to me that with asset prices so high, it's breaking in that is the hardest point.
Okay, and is that the fault of negative gearing? Ken?
Negative gearing is not the evil to all these things. If you go back to your first question, Madeleine, when you look at Australia, cities, we've got some great cities. I think they've had a great 2 decades. Whether you're talking about Melbourne, you're talking about Perth, you're talking about Brisbane. But one of the things we haven't got right is housing affordability, no doubt about that. And the context of our cities is one that our cities are growing.
I'll just move that microphone a little more directionally towards you, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
How's that?
Is that
better?
Yeah, that should be
loud
better.
and clear.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Great. Thank you.
Our cities have been growing, and that growth is accelerating and concentrating in our cities. So we need housing supply frameworks to keep up with that population growth, and that's been one of the big drivers that we haven't been able to produce enough housing to keep up with that demand. Supply and demand, that's the big market force that's very hard to fight against. And we've got to run to keep up with that household formation rate, that population growth rate, and we haven't been successful enough in doing that over the last couple of decades.
And why is that?
Look, you have to look at there's a lot of planning issues at stake here, but the planning systems haven't kept track with how our cities have changed. So we're growing, but our cities are changing as well. So we used to be an economic base, which was when it was based on the industrial age, the manufacturing age. Then a lot of the employment was centred around hubs of manufacturing. So our economy has transitioned and continues to do so, and more of our employment now centres around services and is located in places like the Melbourne CBD. So you've got this change dynamic, but fundamentally we haven't kept up with the growth or the change. So we haven't had systems which have clearly identified the housing growth, the housing supply growth we need. We haven't translated that down into the nitty-gritty of council planning arrangements. We haven't invested sufficiently in our cities to provide the infrastructure to join them up and connect where people live, where they might choose to work. So there's a hell of a lot of different dynamics there, but overwhelmingly It's the supply side that hasn't kept up with demand.
So if we're going to talk about that supply side then Labor has in the last week come up with an idea of how we might be able to increase supply, and that's by allowing negative gearing only on new build. Marion, do you see that as being a potential solution to the problem?
Well, so negative gearing is one of a suite of tax advantages that go to investors. There's a suite of advantages that also go to homeowners. So home buying as a whole is very tax advantaged, and a lot of money is spent on it at Commonwealth and state level. But when you're talking about negative gearing, you're talking about the investor side of the market, and of itself, it's not really about adding new supply to the market.
Mm-hmm.
Can I think that's often said, and what's not often understood is that if you look at the sales of newly developed housing, 27% of it is purchased by investors. So that's a pretty big slab of that new housing stock. So if you start playing around with the taxation arrangements and effectively penalising investors previous to current circumstance, then you'll definitely have less of those. So I think it's unsurprising to say that the bulk of investors invest in existing housing stock. If you take a city like Melbourne, what's added in any 1 year is only a pretty small proportion of the total housing stock in the city. But if you look at how important is investors to the supply of new housing, it's very important. So I think it's underrated, that issue.
So, but I mean, would this idea from Labor of only allowing negative gearing for new builds, would that not just increase the proportion of investors who are getting into it?
What Labor's announced is a number of things. So no negative gearing on existing, negative gearing only being limited to new housing supply, but also quite a significant change to the capital gains tax arrangements. Now, capital gains tax was put in place by Paul Keating when he was Treasurer. He put an indexation arrangement there so that you were only taxing true gains, not nominal gains, i.e. took into account inflation. That was changed under the Howard years to simplify it, and so there was a 50% discount for capital gains tax put in place. So Labor would halve that. So the combination of those changes means that you would be worse off as an investor, certainly much worse off going into existing markets, but also worse off going into a new housing or purchasing new housing, newly constructed housing. So what we see as an outcome of that is a lot less investors going into housing. In fact, that's what it's designed to do. So if you have that, go back to supply and demand again, if you've got less investors going into the market quite considerably, putting aside the distortion that would happen in 2017, the year that would be introduced, then you definitely have big impacts on the supply of investment housing, which would have a big impact on rents. You'd also have a significant impact on construction levels. So, we're concerned that because these are quite broad, highly interventionist changes are being proposed, that actually they distort the housing market, the housing investment market, quite considerably, and have quite suboptimal outcomes.
I'll come to you, Jenny, for just a comment on that, and then we'll make sure that we go open to some questions. So if you do have a question, please do make sure you raise your hand, and the ushers will come to you. So, I mean, Jenny, you sort of deal with people who are at the very opposite of that investment market, the people who are actually hoping to be able to rent from those very same investors. So where do you stand on this debate about investment and negative gearing?
Well, I think, like Marion, we think it's a complex set of changes that need to be made, not just negative gearing, and we can come to that. It's not a magic bullet, but we think it's an important ingredient. Because we understand the figures are that for investors accessing negative gearing, 92% of those purchases are existing builds. So that's only 8% for new builds. And for foregoing $4 billion a year in taxation for that, we think we should be getting more bang for our buck, and that money would be better spent at the lower end of the scale, because that's where we're missing out. Tonight in Melbourne, there will be 83,000 properties that are vacant, at least. Ones with the water turned on. We don't know about the ones with the water.
Did you say 83,000?
83,000, according to the Prosper report. Now, that's obscene. You know, we've got 34,000 people on our public housing waiting list, we've got 23,000 people who are homeless, and we've got 83,000 vacant properties. Something is wrong with the settings. So, I wouldn't want to argue with economists about what those settings should be, but, whether it's, negative gearing, capital gains, other taxation settings, combined with the sort of planning mechanisms that Ken's alluded to, as well as direct investment by government, we can do better.
Okay. Who's going to start us off with a question? Yes, sir. Can we just have the microphone? Excuse me. Oh, right. Sorry. I didn't see you. Can you just make sure that you give me a big wave when you've got a question? Sorry. We'll come to you next, sir. Apologies.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you for letting me ask the questions. My name is Dot Letch. I'm representing an organisation that's just being created called Oasis Housing. My question is, public housing represents only 5% of housing in Australia, which is government provided. Successive governments have reduced the amount of public housing available by constantly relying on the private sector investment, negatively geared properties, of which we know now there are 83 vacant properties in Melbourne alone. This makes it extremely difficult. We've got 35,000 people on public housing waiting lists. My question is, have successive governments abrogated their responsibility for providing housing to the private sector, and why?
So it's to be housed is a really fundamental need. There are a number of different ways to meet that need. So traditionally we had a lot of public housing, quite variable across different states as to how they did it, but so that's one way that governments have provided housing to low-income people and people who may not be competitive in the private rental market to be able to get a place. But the other way that governments do it is through income support and particularly rent assistance. And one of the problems that is quite evident, I think if you walk around the streets of Melbourne now and see people sleeping rough, it's much more prevalent than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. And that is because, in no small part, because the relative value of New Start allowance and rent assistance is not enough for a person to be able to secure a property, even on a shared basis in many cases in the private rental market. So it doesn't seem to me that it has to be provision through public housing, but there has to be an adequate provision. And I think when you do see a lot of people sleeping rough, you've got to question whether that is occurring.
Yes, I mean, the average in Australia for social housing, which is, a mix of public and community housing, is around 5%. In Victoria, it's only 3.4%.
Just explain the difference between public and community housing.
Well, public's where the government runs it directly through its, public service housing office, and community is where it's run by an NGO. And, I think there's a role for both ways of providing that housing. So I think there's a role in taxation, there's a role in planning, there's a role in getting the private sector more involved, superannuation funds more involved in funding, but there will always be a role for directly funded social housing because it's not a market that can sustain itself.
So do you think 5% is enough?
No, it's not enough.
What would you like to give us a figure? What do you think it needs to be?
Oh, look, it varies enormously internationally. From I think the UK's been up around 20%. It's been Scandinavian countries have very high levels. I think what you find in all of those different markets is that the settings for a whole lot of things are different. So it's very hard. It's very much apples and pears. But in our community, as the person who asked the question said, we have had government after government for a very long time now not invest directly in social housing, at the same time as the needs for it have continued to be there and continued to grow, and the housing market has become less and less acceptable. You know, a whole range of social needs were predicated on the assumption that public housing would continue to grow at the rate that it was 20 and 30 years ago. You know, deinstitutionalisation of many of our services. There's no reason why people can't live in the community, but on, you know, benefits, they can't pay market rates. They never were going to be able to. They probably never will be able to. There will always be a requirement for a subsidy from some source. So rental assistance was never going to be able to keep pace.
You know, Jenny's very much the expert on this, but the likelihood of Australia sort of, you know, doubling its public housing stock, I think, is pretty unlikely. You know, the governments now have health costs that they could go quite different from what they faced, you know, a generation ago. So I think the interesting debate is the thing that Jenny raised there around, well, how do we structure deals so you can tap private sector investment to increase supply of housing targeted for that, you know, key worker housing, community housing. What's the partnerships you need to form between government, community organisations and private developers to make that work? And when you look around the world, in, you know, in other like systems, you know, in US, for example, there's a lot more variety of schemes to try to make that work than what you see in Australia. So I think there's opportunity in the context that you know, state treasurers are not likely to write big cheques, or not like to write cheques which are double the size of what the cheques they currently write. That we need to be looking at other ways to bring some of this supply on. So a bit of policy ingenuity, I think.
So, I mean, you know, that was tried in the Rudd-Gillard years with maybe it was Gillard specifically with the National Rental Affordability Scheme, for example, NRAS, which, does everyone know what NRAS is? It's a very complicated scheme whereby basically you try and get private investors, you give them some government money, around $11,000 a year, and they invest in new builds, and which they then set for 20% below market rate rent. So it was meant to generate, I think, 50,000 new homes. I think at this point it's generated 35,000 new homes, and the current government is not planning on keeping the scheme going or rolling out any new properties, is my understanding. Yeah. So how is that? You know, that's one example of how has that worked or not worked?
Well, you know, it did work pretty well. I mean, there was you know, I think it got critiqued because there was perhaps an overinvestment going to student housing because that model worked better on the numbers. So that was where, you know, some of or a decent amount of that investment was funneled. So, but, you know, having said that, it was a good attempt by the previous government to have a crack at creating a financial model which was going to see the private sector underpin a public good. So, you know, it was pretty good, and we were certainly critical of the government when they abolished that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Next question.
You say there's 83,000 units vacant around Melbourne and one thing and another. Yeah, vacant around Melbourne. What percentage of foreign interests are involved in that 83,000?
Well, nobody knows, and that's part of the reason why the federal government set up their foreign purchaser register, which is only very recently been in operation. So we won't have good data for a little while, but we will. That's only on
buildings on homes over a certain value, though, isn't it?
No, any purchases of any. So foreigners are prevented from buying existing property in Australia, but they're able to buy newly constructed property. The logic being, well, that helps, you know, drive construction activity, and that's good for jobs. So those are now required to be registered, and we will over time build up a better picture of who owns what. But, you know, I think there's a bit of a myth here that foreign investment in our housing in our cities is much greater than it really is. You know, part of that is lack of knowledge and lack of data. Part of that's good old Aussie xenophobia, which can be there in spades as well. But, if you go back to that first question you asked, Madeleine, around, why is housing affordability a problem in Australia, it's not because of, the foreigners are buying it all.
Mm-hmm. Jenny or Marion, did you have a view on that one? You wanted to jump in?
I don't think we know. I think we know that we probably almost have enough capacity out there to deal with our problems, but the incentives are clearly there for large numbers of investors to hang on to their properties to realise the capital gain. Mm-hmm. So the homes are there, the people aren't in them, investors are profiting over time. Something's wrong with this picture, and I think we need to come up with a solution. We don't have a plan. We actually don't have a plan in this community for addressing the shortage of supply at the lower end of the market. So vulnerable people will continue to end up becoming homeless. I think we'll see when the census figures are collected this year that it will have increased quite considerably. Our services in Victoria have had 30,000 people who are currently renting and paying mortgages in the private market, not in the social housing market, come to them this year. That's a 30% increase.
So if you were Housing Minister and Daniel Andrews said, we need to address this problem, but you can't have any more money because we've got to fix the hospitals and we've got to pay for that road and that train line, so fix it, but you can't have any more money, what would you be doing?
Well, I'm sure that's what Daniel is saying to Martin Foley at the moment. And unfortunately, I think that's what, Commonwealth and state governments have said to each other for a long time. And there's a fair bit of argy-bargy that goes on. I do think governments have to directly invest in social housing. That's got to be part of the solution. I think our taxation settings are self-evidently incorrect and are not giving a healthy mix of producing a healthy mix of housing for a healthy community where people of all sorts of strengths and capabilities can live together closely, and we need to change that. I think we need to go and talk to the Planning Minister about what he's... our current government here in Victoria has a commitment to inclusionary zoning on public land, and I think we'd like to see that happen, and I think we'd like to see it go beyond public land. So that's every time there's a development or a redevelopment, we need to be thinking about lower cost housing as part of that, whether it's social housing or affordable housing, or NRAS would have been a perfect device for doing some of that. We don't do that. Fisherman's Bend, completely redeveloped, no inclusionary zoning caveat on that at all. What an opportunity missed. We will continue to miss those opportunities unless we have some form of inclusionary zoning.
Marion, I could see you trying to come in there.
Yeah, so...
just bring the mic a bit closer to you.
So there's a few things that you can do. So I would say it seems a bit unrealistic to have no budget, but say there's no... So for me, one thing I think could happen at the Commonwealth level is to have a more realistic level of rent assistance. So at present, the maximum rate of rent assistance is $129 per fortnight for a single person.
It's not a lot of money.
Per fortnight. So it's very low, and the maximum rate of New Start for a single person is a bit over $500 a fortnight. So very low amounts of money. So seems pretty unrealistic that someone is going to get what you might think would be sort of a lower quartile private rental for that kind of money. And I think it's simply too low. But there is another lever available to governments, and Jenny just alluded to it with the Planning Minister. So what we do in this country and in this city is we have a lot of rules and regulations essentially about the quality of housing. So we mandate how dense it can be and what sort of facilities and whether it has to have a car park and all sorts of things like that. And we do that because as a community we do care about those things and we don't want slums. But it's also true that those things have got a cost. And to the extent that you can relax those requirements, you can open up the space for lower cost housing that people may be perfectly happy with, that is perfectly safe. It might be cramped or it might be this or that. It might not be beautiful, but it would be secure, safe, reasonable and decent and more affordable.
So the other thing we could do is have the federal government put some incentives on the table to address this issue. So if you look at most governments have done planning reform over the years, and you look at it and it's a lot of change of processes and acronyms. It's very hard to understand, and you get to the end of it and things might have got better a little bit, but not really enough. Now back in the 1990s when Hawke then Keating was Prime Minister, they had a number of intractable problems which were preventing us growing productivity and driving economic growth. So they developed national competition policy off the back of a big report from Fred Hilmer. So there's an opportunity to sort of to use that model for planning systems and housing affordability, to say, okay, here is a need. It's definitely a social need for our cities and our community. It's definitely an economic need, because if people can be housed appropriately, and if we've got good pipelines of construction activity, that's important for our economy. So let's develop targets, KPIs, and say, okay, well, if you, Victorian government or Queensland government or whatever, are able to meet these KPIs, here's the incentive. And some of those, so it'll be a financial incentive, and that's
so build X number of homes, we'll give you X amount
X
of money.
number of homes. Let's look at some of those. Let's look at targeted supply for that affordable housing stock. Let's look at our overall pipelines of supply, some of the complexity of our planning systems that Marion was just describing there. Let's have a set of agreed indicators. Say, okay, tick, 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 tick. If we do this, we should be producing housing at a much more much more affordable level, but also a volume which is going to mean that even as markets go up and down, which they will continue to do, overall we'll have supply which better meets demand.
Do you think we really need to add another layer of government into the whole housing and planning situation?
Well, this is actually making our governments work together. This is what COAG should do and what it has done in the past. So this is not saying let's have a supra level of government or have federal government take over what states do. It's just recognising that if we get this right, some of the bigger financial benefits from a tax revenue base are actually going to be at the federal government level, because you'll have more income tax and GST and those things that go into the feds. So that should be used to capitalise a kitty to incentivise states to do the right thing.
Any discussion along those levels that you're aware of?
Yeah, we have been talking about this for some time. There's actually very good levels of interest from both sides of politics in this as a concept. We're doing a piece of work at the moment which is not a long way away from being finished, and we'll definitely be shouting that from the rooftops, because we think this is absolutely a pressing need. If you are Malcolm Turnbull or Bill Shorten at the moment and you're thinking about housing affordability, the reality is you don't control that many levers as a Prime Minister, but this is the way of using the Federation to get all the rules and all the policies to line up to achieve the outcome we want, rather than everyone just going their own way and not having a plan.
All right, there's been a lady waiting here for a long time. I actually wanted to speak to this lady next. Thanks, she was here. Yep, she put her arm.
Hi, I'm just going to bring up the topic of public housing and community housing again. As I understand it, with public housing, the rent is based on 25% of your income. When it comes to community housing, I happen to know that the YWCA, as an example, adds on the rent assistance to the price of the rent. And I wondered how they can justify that, since surely that's meant to be assisting the person in paying their rent, but they actually add rent assistance to the price of their rent. So can you answer that, please?
Well, I think government's interest in transferring some of our existing public housing to the community housing sector is partly looking to source that rental assistance into the financial equation. And, community housing providers do a great job and would often be recognised as being very responsive to their tenants and providing them with a great
Do you know anything about that, though? About that, the YWCA adding the
I
cost of rental assistance
the community housing providers would expect that the rental assistance would come their way. And it comes back to...
Anyone here from the YWCA, by any chance? Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
You're dobbing in your own lot. Okay.
But I think it comes back to the pricing model in that community housing and public housing does house people of a wide range of strengths and advantages and disadvantages, and some people need more support than others. And from the homeless service providers very much like to see both public housing and community housing play a big role in prioritising people who are experiencing homelessness and housing them promptly. But that does mean that you have an increased group of people who have had disadvantaged experiences in community housing and in public housing. And so there is a support component. It is expensive to provide, and that's one of the ways that community housing providers go about having enough money to support a diverse group of people.
You clearly brought it up because you think it's wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, it just is wrong because it ends up with making the rent so much more expensive than it is in a community, a public housing situation.
Yes, and our argument would be that instead of it being a global model, that we would like to see government provide a subsidy to provide support to people who need it. We need growth in social housing as part of the mix to make sure that everybody can have a roof over their head, but there's no doubt that some people need support in order to keep that housing, and that's where the subsidy needs to come in from government to pay for it.
Okay. All right, down there. Thank you, sir.
The current government policy settings have got winners and losers, and naturally homeowners seem to be the big winners out of those settings. I'm just wondering of the suite of, I'll call them losers, but the suite of losers that exist, tenants, the homeless, potential homeowners, etc., they don't seem to have a single cohesive, strong voice, because the public debate seems to be driven by the people who currently own homes and what should defend the current policy settings. Can someone help me understand why it is that voice is not being heard? And secondly, why is there no one in the political system who's prepared to stand up and make a statement of principle that says property, residential real estate, as an investment class should not be promoted? It shouldn't be the subject of incentives. It should be the subject of disincentives. Again, I mean, we all understand that it's not being said, but is it such a ludicrous proposition that no politician's
can I just
ever
ask,
going to say?
do you think that's you think that's a reasonable proposition? Do you for homes not to be an investment class? People shouldn't invest on principle in homes.
Not to be promoted, because the current government settings promote it. You either leave it neutral, or in my world, I would add disincentives.
I think your question, there's a couple of things in your question, so I'll take each of them in parts. But the last bit of your question presupposes that investing in housing is bad. There's nothing wrong with investing in housing to provide a roof over someone's head. I mean, every renter needs an investor. I think the reality is that housing, the owner-occupied housing, rental housing is predominantly, putting aside public housing and other assisted housing, I mean, the vast bulk of the housing that's provided to Australians is going to be done in the private market, and that's absolutely what you want, because governments haven't got the money to provide $7 trillion worth of housing to Australians. So you definitely do want the market to do that, but you also. Well, there's a lot of functions of government you would have to shut down if you were asking the government to pay or provide housing for all Australians, putting aside that social or assisted housing. The other thing I'd say is that you made a comment there about renters being losers. So there's definitely a big issue about access to purchasing housing. You know, getting into the market is very difficult. If you're not in the market and you want to purchase, that's a pretty big cliff to climb. And I think that the public policy gap is that bit. So how do we bring down that entry opportunity for people so they can better get into the market? But if you look at current policy settings and how they've delivered for renters, and how they've delivered for rent, well, actually rent has done okay. You know, rent hasn't climbed astronomically like house prices have. So one of the beneficiaries, or one of the side effects of the current taxation arrangements, is that you actually have a lower focus on rental yield. So you have, in fact, I've just saw some data come in this afternoon from CoreLogic, which looked at the declining rental yields over the last 10 years. So rents are actually underpinned by current arrangements and are running at relatively low rates.
If I could just add to that, I think there's a political logic to this which is hard to escape, which is that there's a large number of existing homeowners, and in any given year the number of people who are wanting to become homeowners is a lot smaller. And I think it's hard to imagine that not playing out in an electoral way. I guess the other comment I'd make is that this discussion in some ways seems to be premised on an idea that everybody wants to be a homeowner, but people's patterns of lives are changing, and people have more flexibility. They'll move city or to a different part of the city for work. Their family arrangements are more complex and more fluid, and renting fills a gap for a lot of us that is really useful, and doesn't sort of bed you down in one place in a way that's quite hard to get out, given stamp duty and the costs associated with selling up and moving. So I think it's worth remembering that the goal of this is not to get everybody into home ownership. It's really to have everybody adequately housed, I would have thought.
Can I just ask here, as a show of hands, before we go to the next question, who here would be happy to live in a rental property for the rest of their days? Okay, so that's quite a significant amount of you. So,
and it's probably the rest of their days bit, which is...
Yeah, okay, let's take out the rest of your days. Who would be happy? Yeah. Who would be happy to live in a rental property for the next 5 years or so? Okay, so quite a lot of you, which is sort of, as you say, counterintuitive to what we assume. I'm just going to go on to the next question. We do have so many questions and lots of hands going up. So down the back.
Thank you. I'm a little bit confused. Today in Parliament, Malcolm Turnbull said that the Labor Party's policy on negative gearing and capital gains tax would reduce the cost of people's house, or the value of people's houses dramatically, and all homeowners would be hugely disadvantaged. On the other hand, Bill Shorten said in Parliament today that he wasn't interested in the people that owned 7 houses, he was interested in the people that owned no houses and wanted to get into the market. Is the Labor Party policy going to reduce the cost of housing dramatically?
Well, it's hard to know because there's actually been no modelling. So what their policy is largely based on a piece of work which the McKell Institute did, and the McKell Institute didn't do any modelling behind their proposal either. They made a number of assumptions as to what would happen if this policy setup was changed as proposed. So the answer is they don't know. The opposition doesn't know, and the government presumably doesn't know either. They may well be having Treasury model that up, I don't know. But there's some pretty major changes in policy being proposed here without anybody knowing. And this is one of the problems. And we've seen this in the past when governments, typically just at the wrong time of the cycle, have made significant changes to taxation or other arrangements, and they've had quite a detrimental impact on housing markets. So this is part of the risk factor we see in what's been proposed by the opposition.
We've got a question down the back and then we'll come up the front.
Just to go back to the public housing, social housing and housing allowances and so on, I wonder if anyone would comment on which process in the long term is more economically efficient, to build houses or to give rent assistance? Thinking about over the long term.
Who knows about that? Marion?
I can have a go at that.
Okay.
So governments used to do a lot of construction, and they used to run a lot of utilities, and they used to build public housing and run it. And a lot of people felt that they didn't do it very efficiently, and I think that applies to, electricity companies and constructing roads and all sorts of things like that. So they would build one type of housing, everybody would live in one place, in one kind of housing, one standard, one level of amenity, and I guess I would think that if you gave a person an equivalent amount of money and allowed them to spend that money on the things that they most cared about, they would probably be happier with what they got if it was able to actually buy them something in the market. So some people will prefer to live in near a park, and some people will want to not be close to transport or close to the shops or close to their kids or whatever it might be. People care about different things, and when government provides it, they really have very little choice. So I would have thought, provided the amount of money is enough, that would probably allow people to meet their needs better.
That's just the key question, though. It's the amount of money being the enough, which is the key question.
Well, it's pretty clear that rent assistance is not enough for that. But I would also say that public housing is not really very available to people either. So it's, the choice has, in a sense, only is meaningful if each of those is a real choice.
Okay, we had a question up the front. Thank you.
Yes, I'm concerned about the current hypocrisy in the debate. Today, it showed up very much in terms of Parliament. Malcolm Turnbull, electorate of Wentworth, has the highest diversity of income in the nation, with Double Bay, Potts Point, Rose Bay. 10% of his electorate has represents 50% of the income, while the other 90% basically represents the rest, the other 50%.
So how does that relate to housing affordability?
Well, what it means is that there's many people, there's a few people in Potts Point who can afford multiple houses, and there are a lot of people who can't afford anything. And it's certainly, if we're talking about equity, we should be talking about the way that more people can actually... And this is, Sydney, certainly last year, had a furore in terms of the fact that young people couldn't get into the housing market simply because developers using negative gearing were basically pricing themselves out the market.
Okay, so I'll turn your comment into a question. So, is there a disconnect, do you think, at a level between politicians and what they actually understand about housing affordability and the reality on the ground? Do they get it?
I can't speak for whether Malcolm Turnbull gets it or not. I mean, I think, politicians certainly have good feedback from their electorates, and they understand this is the big issue. In relation to Sydney in particular, I don't know what the gentleman had quoted a lot of stats about Wentworth, and I don't know whether they are correct or not. But I'm happy to take your word for that. When it comes to Sydney, though, Sydney for 10 years undersupplied housing. Some of those years, half the supply of housing of Melbourne. I think there was a 6-month period there where Sydney produced less houses than Adelaide, right? So Sydney spent 10 years getting it almost as wrong as you can, at a time when it also underinvested in infrastructure. And if you're looking for a model of what not to do, that was it. Now, good 18 months of really strong housing construction numbers, but you need more than 18 months to offset 10 years of undersupply. And as the economy in Sydney's picked up, you've got demand without the supply base. And that's the thing that's driven housing prices in Sydney quite dramatically.
To the point where the median price for a detached house in Sydney is now $1 million.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff.
Good luck with that. So, yes, sir.
Marion's point before, I would have thought that the retirement income system is predicated upon you owning a house, and so your idea of people can live in a rental property forever, it's not reality, because as soon as you stop working, your income declines and you can't afford it. You have to throw yourself back on the state anyway. So for that idea that you can continue to rent forever, it just doesn't actually make any sense. The whole retirement income system is all based around owning a house, and in many ways, in many ways, I guess the whole point of home ownership from a public policy perspective is all around building a cohesive society. I mean, we see it as a good thing for people to own their house because it promotes civic awareness and civic responsibility and all those other things. So we think, people owning houses is a really good thing for society. We should be encouraging that. I just think the idea of renting forever is not necessarily not very positive for our society.
Do you want to come back to that, Marion?
Yeah,
We've got 5 minutes, and I'll come to you as well, Jenny. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes left, so we'll try and skip through some questions. Go ahead.
No, thank you for the comment. I think it's quite right that the retirement income, the age pension system is predicated on you owning a house. So I think that's a fair point. So when I think about this, I guess there's sort of quite a long distance between the idea that you buy a house in your 20s and you stay in it till you're on the age pension. And I think we did used to think about it that way, but people do move around. People do want more diversity. There's nothing to stop a person from doing exactly that. But I guess behind what my comment really was the idea that if you don't save through the vehicle of your own housing, if you are a private renter, then that you'll save in some other way. So you do definitely need, I think the system does, as you say, expect that you'll have housing, and if you don't, then you're probably not going to be in great shape if you're a max rate age pensioner.
Jenny, I'll just let Jenny answer really quickly, and then we'll move on to another.
I just think it's a slow and certain change in our society where, we still in some ways think of ourselves as, most of us working until we're 60, 65, having paid off our house and then retiring to a quiet life on a low income. And home ownership is slowly but steadily declining because of the factors that we've been talking about this evening, about the unaffordability of it. More people just can't get in. Our whole human services system is predicated on that old-fashioned, increasingly out-of-date, socially cohesive view about who will require services. So it's not just housing, everything. We're an ageing population. Our entire aged care system is predicated on the idea that you will have a house. Most people will have a house. Very residual services for people who are renting. So many of us are facing an impoverished old age and an inability to afford care when we need it because of this assumption about the house, which is dwindling away over time.
All right, where are we? Down the back? Yep.
Hello, do we know of any like economies that also have negative gearing? And if so, how's that working out for them with new people entering the property market?
That's a good question.
Negative gearing actually is nothing more than the ability to deduct your legitimate expenses from your income. It's actually been in Australia for over 100 years. It's as old as our income tax system. And almost every like economy has some type of deductibility. The Reserve Bank, when it looked at this, said, look, ours might be on the generous side of the spectrum, but not overly so. So there are a number of other countries that have the same arrangements.
So in Scandinavian countries, for example, we compare ourselves a lot with the Scandinavians. For
look, I don't know exactly what the details are in Scandinavia.
Typically that you can deduct it against investment income, but not against your income from your employment.
Right. Okay.
I understand in the US they don't have it anymore, and their availability of rental properties is usually over 5%, and ours steadily is underneath 5%.
Right. Okay. All right. Just time for. We've got 2 minutes left. Let's go for it.
Right. Sorry if I mumble. Sorry if I stumble. I'm fairly nervous. Just as an aside before I begin, you know how you had that question of how many people here would be happy to rent in the next 5 years or the rest of their life? Sorry. I'd be interested to see how many of those would be happy never owning a house or an asset, especially when we talk about it being a very sensible investment option. Because I think those do begin to be two different questions, one being looking at it as the social side, and the second being that financial investment side, because they are two different conversations. What I really want to talk about, though, was we had this talk about there's an issue right now with the supply side of housing, and then we also had this talk about how there's, I think the number was 85,000 homes which are vacant, and I don't know what the expected or normal rate of vacancy is. Maybe as a percentage, it's quite normal for a vacancy turnover, and it's just in numbers, it's quite shocking. But if we do have a lack of supply, and we've got so many houses which are vacant, and we've got people who want to be in these houses, why is this happening? Is there a lack of incentive for investors, if they are the main owners of these vacated houses, to not actually be filling them with renters and to not actually provide housing and just hold an asset and hold an investment? And if so, and even if not so, what do we do here? And how do we, that seems to me like a disconnect. You're saying we don't have enough, we've got people who don't have houses. Okay. How do we make these 2 points meet?
That's a very sensible question. It'll have to be the last question for the evening. Who wants to start that? And we'll
I'll have a crack. I think it's 83,000. We came from water data. So there's a question about it because I think the minimum threshold was 50 buckets of water in a day, I think, which is a unbelievably high number. So
Jenny's shaking her head, by the way.
I question whether it's 83,000.
Enough for a dripping tap.
Yeah, but that's a lot of buckets of water. That's a tap that's more than dripping, I would say.
All right.
But anyway, so is it 83,000? Well, nobody really knows. I don't know. In any city you'll have holiday homes that will be counted as part of that. You would have people who are moving as part of that. You'd have places which are about to go through a renovation, which are part of that. You'd have people who live in the country but work in the city through the week, or vice versa. Would be part of that.
So let's assume that
it probably all adds up.
Let's assume that there is a portion which is vacant because for whatever, which is not people moving. I mean, how do you have any solutions for how we can actually marry those two?
I guess I'd go back and say that there's always going to be some level of vacancy in the market for all those types of factors, and probably more. The key thing is about making sure we've got the pipeline of new housing coming on, so that as we're creating new households, whether that's in the delivery ward or off the airplane, we've got the housing to match our growing population.
Sounds like we need a Tinder app for homes and people needing rent and needing places to live. Jenny, I'll let you finish up, and we'll have to leave it there because I've got the red light beeping.
Well, I think I agree with Ken. What we need is an approach, a plan for making sure that there is supply of lower priced housing.
But that's again focused on the supply rather than on the existing vacant houses, which is what the lady was asking a question about.
Well, many of them may not be lower priced housing. They may be high priced housing sitting there for capital gain appreciation over time, and on balance the investors decided to leave them sit rather than make them available. We don't know, as Ken said, but I think it will take a plan for us to make sure that every person in Victoria is able to put a roof over their head, which is our human responsibility.
Did you have a final word, Marion?
The final word I'd say is that housing is one part of a complex system, and if we do have these disparities that Jenny's data is suggesting, then it's really about the distribution of income and opportunity across society, and housing is one manifestation, but you can't solve all things through housing.
Seems like a very sensible place to finish. Well, thank you everyone for coming, bearing with us. I'll say Marion Terrill, Ken Morrison and Jenny Smith, thank you very much.